try to play a very brief clip, but in order to see that, you might want to bring those lights down a little bit.
What will your last 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? Will you grow old with vitality? Or get old with disease? It's time to decide.
So I'm going to be speaking to you today about this topic of fasting. Now, there's been a lot of popular press about intermittent fasting. Walter Longo and others have published a lot of research where you narrow the feeding window. For example, if you don't eat breakfast before a certain time, you don't eat dinner after a certain time, maybe you have an 8-hour feeding window, which gives you a 16-hour period of fasting every night. And even that amount of time is thought to induce metabolic changes that are associated with benefit. There's also patterns where you would say, for example, reduce your calorie intake on 1 or 2 days a week to 600 calories by eating, say, just fresh fruits and vegetables. And narrowing the feeding window and narrowing the calorie intake may be associated with weight loss and all kinds of benefits. That's not actually what I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about medically supervised water-only fasting of periods of 5 to 40 days, which is done in an inpatient setting like what we do at the True North Health Center in Santa Rosa, California. Fasting is defined as the complete abstinence of all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. One of the issues with fasting is you have to rest, because if you don't, you increase your glucose needs because of muscular activity in addition to brain activity, and the only place you can get that glucose during fasting is from breaking down proteins from gluconeogenesis. So when you're fasting, you want to burn fat, you don't want to burn excess protein, and so one of the important things in fasting is that rest is provided. Most important thing with water-only fasting, particularly prolonged water-only fasting, is patient selection. It's important that people that are appropriate candidates for fasting fast, people that are not don't. The way you do that is through a medical history, a physical exam, and laboratory evaluation. It's important to have this data because you have to be able to tell the difference between a healing crisis, that is an acute response that the body generates in an attempt to get well, and a problem. And sometimes they look very similar. And so the way you're able to tell the difference is having appropriate baseline data and appropriate monitoring. There are certainly people that should not water fast. For example, if you're pregnant or lactating, if you're lactating and you try to do a prolonged fast, you will lose your milk. Not a good thing. Anorexia nervosa and diabetes type 1, if you don't make insulin, you're not going to be able to do a water-only fast because you need insulin in order to adapt to the fasting process. Recent stroke, MI, pulmonary embolisms, DVT, these conditions make it problematic because although fasting reduces the risk of those conditions, it's not absolute protection. And most patients with these types of problems are on medications that can't be easily or quickly withdrawn. Severe kidney disease prevents long-term fasting because you need a certain level of kidney function in order to be able to adapt to fasting. Porphyria is a condition that would contraindicate fasting, as well as deficiency depletion cachexia, or MCAD. MCAD is medium-chain acetyl-coenzyme A dehydrogenase deficiency. It's a rare genetic defect where you can't break down fat and utilize it effectively, and therefore fasting would be a problem. Fasting duration ranges from 5 to 40 days at the True North Health Center. That's 5 to 40 days on water only. People say, well, they read in the Bible that Moses, David, Elijah, and Jesus fasted for up to 40 days. I tell my patients they're in good company. The average fast, though, is between 1 and 3 weeks, and the typical patient that we see are people that have conditions of dietary excess. So they have high blood pressure, they have diabetes, they have autoimmune diseases, they have certain types of cancer like lymphoma. Some patients, you can resolve their issues in a single fast. Others, it might take several fasts in order to get satisfactory resolution. So I'm going to share with you one case report. This was a young woman, and this paper was actually published in the British Medical Journal. And this patient was 42 years old at the time we first saw her. She had follicular lymphoma stage 3, had been well diagnosed at the medical school. You can see her tumor sizes listed there, and she'd gone through all of the standard diagnostic testing to confirm her condition. It had progressed over a couple of years. Her family doctor had assured her, when she questioned him, that diet had no relationship to lymphoma. It didn't matter what she ate, she could eat whatever she wanted. When she asked him about the possibility of doing fasting, he told her that was criminal quackery. She went to the oncologist and got a similar story, and given that tremendous medical support, decided to come to the True North Health Center, where she underwent water-only fasting for 21 days, during which time you could actually feel her externally palpable lesions disappear. She fasted for 21 days, she refed for 10, she went back to the oncologist at the medical school with some coaching, and he examined her, checked her chart. She said, he examined her again. And finally, he asked her what happened. And she said that she had gone to the criminal quacks and done the fasting, and her tumors disappeared. He expressed some surprise, said he'd have to give us a call. But he told her that since she was still neutropenic, she could probably do with some gentle chemotherapy, which she refused. And on follow-up, a couple months later, she had continued to make progress. Eventually, her white counts normalized, and so she never did undergo conventional treatment. We did manage to get her to get a follow-up CT scan at the time and continued to follow her case. This was her before and after CT, We continued to follow her actually for 3 years, and this is her whole body scan 3 years later. She's completely cancer-free. She continues to do that, and she's maintained a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. Okay. Blood pressure is another condition we treat commonly. As I mentioned this morning, if you do not have high blood pressure by the time you reach retirement age, you're quite abnormal. The blood pressure is measured with two numbers. The top number, systolic blood pressure, represents the pressure of the blood in the vessels when the heart contracts, and the bottom number, or diastolic blood pressure, represents the pressure in the vessel when the heart's relaxed. These are independent risk factors for all-cause mortality. They're one of the more sensitive biological tests that we use to predict if you're going to die prematurely. High blood pressure and the conditions related to it are actually the leading contributing cause of death and disability. They're the main justification for prescription medications. It's worth a lot of money to the medical profession for monitoring and treating this condition. Congestive heart failure, which kills close to 300,000 people, is the major contributing cause is high blood pressure. Stroke, which you have 790,000 plus people a year have strokes, the main risk factor, high blood pressure. It's such a common problem, and yet the treatment for it is largely disappointing. The medications that are used for blood pressure can't be justified until blood pressure rises to a certain level, because more people will die as a consequence of the treatment than the condition itself. The majority of people that actually have a heart attack or stroke from their high blood pressure don't have blood pressure high enough to justify the risk of medication. If your blood pressure, for example, is 130/88, you have 5 times the risk of having a heart attack, but you can't justify taking medication except unless there's end-organ target disease, because more people will actually die from the treatment. For every point you reduce your blood pressure 1 point from diet and lifestyle change, you reduce your risk of all-cause mortality 1%, and that risk factor probably goes down to 90/60, not 120/80. But of course, that's how we treat blood pressure: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 medications. And those medications have significant side effects, not just in chronic cough, fatigue, and impotence, but also death. What does work at treating high blood pressure, we know, is weight loss. Losing weight will, for every kilogram of weight you lose, there's a 1.6-point drop in systolic blood pressure. Vegetarian high-fiber diets lower blood pressure, as does alcohol reduction. Exercise works quite well, almost as well as any combination of medications, which are good for about 12-point drop in systolic blood pressure, but not without, as we mentioned, risk. Aggressive salt restriction: if you limit your salt to less than 1 milligram of sodium per calorie, you can see a blood pressure drop more significant even than medication in many cases. And John McDougall did a study where he combined those. He got an average drop of 17 points, which was only exceeded by a study we did at the True North Health Center with T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University, where we got an average drop of 37 points in blood pressure in 174 consecutive patients, published in a paper, JNPT. And of those 174 people, 174 people were able to lower their blood pressure enough to eliminate all needed medication, and those that are willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat well, exercise, and go to bed on time can sustain those results. If you look at just stage 3 hypertension, where blood pressure starts at 180 or higher systolic blood pressure, our average effect sizes were 60 points. And that's 60 points not taking into account the fact they start on medications artificially lowering their pressure, and they end off medication. So it's 60 points plus whatever effect their medication was having. This is the largest effect size that's ever been shown in treating high blood pressure in humans. Moderate levels of hypertension respond proportionally. We published a second paper looking at borderline hypertension. People were not high enough in order to justify meds, but were still at risk from their blood pressure, and of course their results were proportional. We ended up with a contract with the International Union of Operating Engineers, California's most powerful labor union, the guys that build all the highways. And we presented a paper to their group on invitation, suggesting that utilizing fasting and diet might work more effectively than what they were currently doing. We did a study where we actually took the first 30 consecutive operating engineers that they sent us. We put them through an average of 3 weeks of fasting followed by refeeding, and we ended up getting a drop of 26 pounds that was sustained, a drop of 30 points on systolic and diastolic, and they saved more money in the first year than the entire cost of the program. What was interesting about that particular group was that when they first when they first made this a fully covered program, they sent in patients, but they hadn't fully advised them about the nature of the program. I'll tell you about that at the very end. This is just a brief case report. This was a dentist who had been outside and got hit in the head with a tent pole, developed a traumatic brain injury. She ended up with a severe headache, as you can imagine, but it didn't go away. This woman ended up with 16 years of constant daily head pain. Every moment she was awake, she had a head pain of 8 to 10 out of 10 or more for 16 years. She became disabled. In desperation, eventually came to the center. We did a 41-day water fast with her, followed by 6 months of careful refeeding, followed by a second 40-day water-only fast, and now we've got a 6-year history without any cephalgia. So the question is it really safe? Can you really take people and put them on water only for periods up to 40 days and do it safely? To answer that question, we did a study, fasting safety study. We used the common terminology criteria for adverse events from the National Cancer Institute. We took every patient for a period of 5 years, looked at every symptom that those patients had had, and went through and graded them according to standard. Grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is death. We had no deaths. We had only one serious event, which was a low sodium level, which was resolved easily with intravenous fluids, and ultimately determined that fasting can be done safely and effectively in young people and in old people. And this was published in a peer-reviewed index journal just recently, and it's opened up not only for us, but all other researchers interested in doing long-term fasting the opportunity to do so. So the real question is, how is it possible that doing nothing can work so well at treating the leading causes of death and disability? What percentage of people do you think that undergo water-only fasting lose weight? Yeah, 100%. It sounds quacky, but the reality is the laws of physics and thermodynamics tell you if you don't eat, you're going to lose weight, and we know you lose it at about 1 pound a day. 100% of the people that go through fasting also go through natriuresis. They eliminate selectively the excess sodium that accumulates in the body. Along with the excess sodium elimination goes the water volume, which drops blood pressure. So blood pressure normalizes, non-healing wounds heal, congestive heart failure starts to reverse. Are people really toxic? You hear about this. People are toxic, that there's accumulated intermediary products and metabolism in their cells, PCB, dioxin, pesticide residues. Is that true? You betcha. You can take a fat biopsy of a human, break it down, and get up to 200 different chemicals in various concentrations. And in concentration, these chemicals are thought to interfere with cellular production, increase the aging response, and possibly make us more vulnerable to cancer. In fasting, you rapidly mobilize and eliminate these accumulated products. In fact, it's so rapid, some people say it's dangerous unless you take their proprietary products. According to Walter Longo, publishing in the Journal of Metabolism 2015, the combination of fasting and chemotherapy results in dramatically higher cancer-free survival than chemotherapy alone. It turns out that during fasting, there's something called differential stress sensitization and differential stress resistance. And what that means is cancer cells don't like the fasting state, probably because of their higher metabolic rate, and healthy cells are protected during fasting. So when they use fasting in conjunction with conventional chemotherapy, cancer cells are more vulnerable, and they've done this now in rats, and they're doing it in people as well. And as he said, it enhances cancer-free survival. Enzymes are induced during fasting not only to mobilize, as you would imagine, fat and protein and carbohydrates, but also for detoxification. That's how you detoxify, or enzymatically driven pathways that are induced during fasting. Fasting reduces insulin resistance. We've been learning about that just here in the last half an hour. Insulin resistance is reduced with fasting, and it's very profound to the point where 80% of our type 2 diabetics can eventually achieve normal blood sugar levels without medication. The gut is a tunnel from your mouth to your rectum, and when you swallow something, it's going through that tunnel. It's not actually in your body unless it gets through the intestinal mucosa, represented here like by a screen that works much like a screen does to keep flies out. Nothing gets in unless the screen becomes damaged, stuff leaks through. That's essentially what gut leakage is. And when those proteins leak through in genetically vulnerable people, the immune system reacts and it begins to attack your own tissues. If it attacks your lungs, we call it asthma. If it attacks your joints, we call it arthritis. What do you think could damage your intestinal tract enough to cause that type of those openings? Well, it's inflammation. And what's a good example of inflammation or a source of inflammation? Smoking. That's why people get smoker's face. When you look at a person like this, you realize that cross-linkage tissue is nothing, that's what a wrinkle is, it's cross-linked collagen tissue. It comes from the free radicals of smoking. Of course, smoking doesn't just affect your face, it affects the inside lining of your blood vessels as well, which is why smokers get so much heart disease. In fact, heart disease saves smoker from lung cancer. 80% of smokers never get lung cancer because they die from heart disease before they live long enough to grow their tumors. I'm surprised cigarette manufacturers don't make their cigarettes even more deadly. If everybody died of heart disease, they could probably advertise it as cancer safe. Fasting normalizes the sympathetic tone, which keeps everything in balance. Fasting has a huge psychospiritual impact. It's interesting that every religion, no matter how diametrically opposed on other things, have a common tradition of fasting. From the Jains to the Jews to the Muslims, Hindus, the Christians, everybody's got a tradition about fasting because it changes how you feel about yourself, and it impacts your physiological functions as well. Fasting enhances the immune system. It doesn't suppress it. It increases autophagy. And probably most impressively of all is fasting affects taste neuroadaptation. We're doing a study right now at the True North Health Center, a clinical trial that actually measures quantitatively your perception to salt, to sugar, and the changes that happen during fasting. Which brings me to back to my union member, the very first guy I mentioned, who came to the center with diabetes, hypertension, obesity, gets to the center and says, "Oh, I think I'm in the wrong place." I said, "No, you're in the right, I got you on the list, you're right here." He goes, No, I think I'm in the wrong place. And I said, "Well, you're here to get well." He says, "That's not him, he's not sick." I said, "Of course you're sick, you got diabetes and hypertension, you're carrying a keg around in your belly, you're gonna die." And he said, "Oh yeah? Aren't we all gonna die?" That's a good point, but I said, "Well, let's look at it a different way. You're on $860 a month worth of medications. If we get you off all those drugs, you won't need the medications anymore. You'll save all that money." And he said, "What do I care? The union pays for my drugs." And at this point, I realized this is not my normal, self-selected, highly motivated patient that I'm used to dealing with. But I'm thinking about his medical history, and we know males with diabetes and hypertension often develop little problems. And I said, "Well, if we get you off all those drugs, I think we can do something about your little problem." Now, he starts to stand up, and I'm like, uh-oh. He's a pretty big guy. And he says, "Why the hell didn't you just say so?" So he's telling me about his diet diary, and this is what he ate, except I couldn't actually get a picture. What he ate was that, but without that disgusting green stuff at the top there. If there was any lettuce on it, he would get rid of that. So before we started fasting, we decided we better feed him a little bit of good food, and we gave him some food from the center, and he was starting to eat the food, but he was like, and I'm thinking, oh my God, maybe he's got a tumor. He can't swallow the food. I said, it looks like you're having trouble with the food. He said, yeah, it's disgusting. He said, this is not food. He said, if I have to eat tasteless swill like this, I'd rather just die. He says, why don't you go out to my truck, get my 12 gauge. When I'm not looking, just shoot me in the head. So we checked him in. Ended up fasting 26 days on water, normalizes his blood pressure, his blood sugar levels. After fasting, we're giving him some of the same food we gave him before the fast, but now he's actually eating the food. And when I sat down and I said, it looks like you're doing better with the food now, he says, yeah, your damn chef's finally getting the hang of it. Took 20 minutes to convince him it was the same food, but he said, no, that stuff we tried to give him in the beginning was disgusting. He said, this stuff's not bad. He wouldn't have complied for a meal without fasting, but now he was able to actually eat the food. In summary, fasting decreases glucose and IGF-1, it decreases blood pressure, heart rate, insulin, inflammation. It increases leptin, the satiety hormone. After fasting, not only are your insulin levels stabilized and your blood sugar levels stabilized, but the actual neurohormones associated with satiation are increased, and so you're able to reach satiety without the overeating. It increases insulin sensitivity. We mentioned cellular stress, resistance, and adaptation. It increases things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. For example, rats in a cage, if you give one an exercise wheel and the others that don't, the ones that can exercise have much lower Alzheimer's rate, dementia rates, and their brain-derived neurotrophic factors are much higher. It turns out that all of the things that go up with exercise also go up with fasting. Now that's not intuitively obvious because you think, well, you're fasting, you're resting, and exercise, you're vigorous. Why is it affecting these neurochemistry the same? And it's probably because both exercise and fasting undo the consequences of dietary excess. And when you undo the consequences of dietary excess, you enhance the quantity and quality of your life. Fasting normalizes the gut microbiota, it stimulates B-cell immunity, and it reverses all major abnormalities of metabolic syndrome. And I'm pretty sure I've used up my time, but if there's any time for questions, I'd be happy to try to answer those.